So basically, what Gattino and Solanas did is they broke cinema down into essentially three sections, right? So if you could think of a lot of it in the same way you think of like third worldist theory, right? The three worlds, right? The first world being the imperial order, right? The second world being kind of maybe countries that are on the periphery that can kind of like benefit from it, but they're not totally as strong as say the United States, right? Who was the imperial kind of, king and still kind of is in like in that unipolar world. And then the third cinema would be the peripheral countries, the neo-colonial or colonial countries, the third world, right, or global south is what we would call it now, right, or developing world and things like that. So they broke that down also into a kind of cinema breakdown for analytic purposes, but also for production, ultimately really for production purposes. So first cinema would be a corporate produced cinema, bourgeois mode of production, meant to help proliferate capitalist ideology through an apparatus of mass culture, right? So this, if you wanted me to break it down to the most simple, think of your favorite Hollywood movie, right? All of them. And I'm not talking about, well, would this be first cinema or not? No, everything that comes out of there would be first cinema. The way you would have to analyze anything that comes out of that mode of production would be from a first cinema lens. This is not to discredit or discard the film completely, but it's to say, if you're not thinking about that primarily, you're already missing the plot in analyzing these kinds of films. It is the first stage of it, right? So Hollywood would be one. One thing to also remember, though, is things that also ape Hollywood. So national cinemas that would come out in colonial or neo-colonial cultures could also be a first cinema piece. Some would say a film like Black Orpheus would be a first cinema film. We can get into that debate another time. Gober Rocha probably would say that, but we can get into that another time. Gober Rocha, the great revolutionary Brazilian filmmaker, Black God, White Devil, wrote one of the kind of proto pieces to proto essays, The Aesthetic of Hunger, which we read. Which proto pieces that kind of like help the first cinema, third cinema movement kind of get its legs, and kind of work in tandem, right? So let's go to second cinema. So second cinema is art house cinema. Individualistic auteur-based expression justifies participation in the bourgeois apparatus by virtue of aesthetic pursuits, ignoring the reality of class struggle and imperialism. So your art movies, right? This can go in a multitude of ways. You could think of them as like the European art films that, if it's being written then in the 60s, movies like, I would say people like Francois Truffaut. I'd be curious what Solanas and Gattino would say about Godard, though they didn't have that much respect for him. There's actually a really funny, there's actually a hilarious story that I was told recently by a woman, Julia Alexieva, or it might be in her book. I think it's in her book actually, and she talks about how Godard wrote a letter to Solanas and Gattino, and they were kind of like rolling their eyes at him. And one of them takes a shot at Godard in their later essays. It's like he's just this European dude trying to be, radical, but bruh, we bout it. You're a kind of second cinema ape, right? One of the things about the art house is like this rejection of Hollywood, right? So they reject Hollywood, right? They say, we don't want to do these big budgets, but they're all about the individual auteur, right? The eye, the great name, right? Even people that I quite like, someone like a Robert Altman or, Sidney Lumet. Sidney Lumet be interesting because he kind of probably would go between first and second cinema, right? Even though I quite like a lot of his films. But the auteur is the big thing, the individual, right? The individual, the really smart filmmaker who kind of thinks about everything. This is a lot of what 70s film would be really second cinema. You would say like early Scorsese before he, really went into a super Hollywood mode of production, and by like Goodfellas, when he was in like Mean Streets.
Yeah.
That would be the height of second cinema, that kind of that kind of idea. And then what you would consider second cinema now are these like artsy movies, something like though I don't know. I would actually have to do a different diagnostic, but I would say things like American fiction would try to purport itself as second cinema, but it's really a first cinema film, to be honest with you. It's like there's nothing, but it's the release measure, right? The idea of this singular thought director, right? But they make all these deals even though they reject big Hollywood, right? And they justify it by this kind of individual is so special, right? But this individual is so special, they're going to ignore the reality of class struggle, colonialism, imperialism. The work does do that, even when it's well done or even sometimes useful. I see someone put Moonlight. Moonlight's a total second cinema movie. That is So Sofia Coppola, it gets interesting, right? Soundtrack to a Coup d'etat is totally a second cinema film, and yeah, Superfly, exploitation films. That's interesting. Second cinema as well, right? Those types of things kind of go into cinema, right?
Crash is first cinema trash.
It doesn't even get a 1, 2, 3, man. I'm sorry. Crash is crashed out. Like, no, so damn racist, man. So someone put Spook Who Sat by the Door in the chat, and when we get to third cinema, I would say, and I think Solanas and Gantino would agree with me, that's a third cinema film. If you think about the mode of production of how Spook Who Sat by the Door was made, its intention.
What would be the question of that, though?
Why would
I would think it automatically fits as third cinema.
I think if someone wouldn't know, like someone wouldn't know the context. Yeah, someone asked in the chat, right? And I think and I take that in a good faith question of being new to this concept, right? Yeah, it's totally a third cinema film. Let's go to third cinema. Probably more I want to say about second cinema a little bit later, but let's do third cinema. A cinema of agitation, right? And when I say agitation, I mean in the kind of like classic Marxist Leninist, right, way, like to agitate, anti-imperialist in form and content. That's very important. Form and content, both of those having a marriage, a dialectical marriage. There's a great essay called The Viewer's Dialectic that talks about that. In aid of the anti-colonial struggle towards national liberation. So the big thing with third cinema was the national liberation element to it. These were films that were aiming to liberate peoples, right? Whether you are still a colony in that way, or a neo-colony, or an internalized colony like Black folk here in America, right? They would acknowledge that it is about national liberation. Looks to develop a class consciousness, activating its audience towards third world liberation. So it wants to activate the audience. It's with the professor you just talked to, and I know y'all had that to me, that great exchange for a second about uncolonize your mind and all that, and how Fanon is used that way, which I've always hated that as well. And I kind of want to talk about that a little bit. How the third cinema people would say it is, no, this is about making an interlocutor that becomes activated to then go out into the street and basically revolt, right? How do you get them educated, agitated enough to basically like say, well, then why the hell am I sitting in a theater, right? Why, the idea that you're watching these horrors, or you're watching these struggles, or you're watching these people who are activating themselves, maybe it'll activate you. You walk out that theater, and go make something happen.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.